Gracefield, Vermont, population 2,103. A small town surrounded by bare branch trees and the kind of silence that accumulates with age. The kind of place where the winters are long and the memories are longer. At the edge of town, tucked behind a dead-end gravel road, sits a compound of grey stone and rotting timbers. 3 buildings, all sealed, all abandoned. Locals still refer to it by its former name, though it hasn't been in operation for nearly 4 decades. Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic, opened in 1973, shuttered abruptly in 1984. No press release, no ceremony, no explanation, just locked doors and dust. What remained behind those doors, however, was far more than forgotten medical records. In March of 2019, a routine asbestos inspection, led by state-contracted renovators, uncovered something that should never have been found. Workers were assigned to clear debris from the southern annex, a wing condemned in the late 80s due to foundational instability. One of the walls had collapsed entirely, exposing rusted piping and a row of empty filing cabinets. All were gutted, all except one. A single cabinet was embedded into the wall behind what had once been a storage closet. Unlike the others, this one had been sealed shut with industrial rivets, its metal surface blackened with mould and heat damage. The crew chief, a man named Henry Lane, assumed it had been scorched in a fire, but there were no fire reports on file, and the cabinet's lock hadn't melted, it had been forced from the inside. When the cabinet was opened, the smell was immediate. A chemical dryness clung to the papers inside, as if they had been embalmed. Dozens of manila folders, each marked with patient initials, dates and short phrases like final entry, transfer withheld, or no return. At the very back, separated by 2 scorched dividers, was a thick leather ledger. It had no cover. Its binding was torn. Its pages were hand-numbered. The ink was faded, but still legible. There were 154 names. The entries were not written in alphabetical order, nor were they listed by date of admission or release. Most had no discharge date at all. Instead, each line followed a grim pattern: patient ID, date of intake, ward assignment, status code, and then blank space. No signatures, no doctors listed, no termination of care, just blank space. Like the record had been paused or deliberately cut short. Alongside the ledger were 4 Polaroid photographs, each depicting the same pale green hallway taken from different angles. The furniture changed, the lighting dimmed, but the hallway remained the same. In one image, there was a figure in the distance, too blurred to be identified. What little could be made out suggested the figure was barefoot, in a hospital gown, and not moving. Next to the photos was an unsent letter, brittle at the edges, folded into thirds. It was addressed to the Vermont Department of Health, dated February 15th, 1985. The sender was Raymond Fell, a name no one had mentioned in connection with Gracefield in over 30 years. Fell had worked as a night orderly for over a decade. His letter was handwritten, barely legible in parts. The ink had run where water had soaked the paper, likely decades before, but enough remained to piece together a disturbing account. The letter began simply, "To whom it may concern, I am writing because I do not believe anyone else will." What followed was a 4-page testimonial. He wrote of disappearances, of voluntary removals that had never occurred, of unregistered patient deaths, of morning roll calls that suddenly came up short, but without any alarms raised, of a phrase that had begun circulating among senior staff in the early 1980s, Code V Null. Fell stated he was instructed never to use it, never to ask what it meant, but each time it appeared in the ledger, it was followed by silence. He claimed some patients had their meals stopped days before the notation was added. Others were removed from their rooms at night and never returned. There were no medical discharges, no phone calls to families, no autopsy logs. According to Fell, these names had not been forgotten, they had been erased. He described overhearing 2 doctors argue outside the records room in 1983. One was yelling about exposure timelines, the other about cross-cohort regression protocols. Fell understood little of the terminology. What he did understand was that patients were being used, that files were being doctored, that some of the people he had helped bathe, feed and speak to for years had vanished, and no one outside the clinic seemed to notice. The letter was never sent. The envelope was never stamped. It was folded neatly, placed beside the ledger, and sealed away in the cabinet no one was meant to find. After the discovery, the contents were immediately reported to state authorities. The Department of Historic Preservation took temporary custody of the documents, citing archival significance. But curiously, within weeks, the materials were transferred again, this time to the Office of Institutional Oversight in Montpellier. From there, they vanished into bureaucracy. But not before photographs were taken. The images, eventually leaked to a local journalist, caused an uproar among residents who remembered Gracefield as a model facility in its time. Progressive, humane, ahead of its era. Former employees remembered music therapy, group painting classes, meditation techniques, years before they were standard practice. Patients were treated, not imprisoned, or so it seemed. Gracefield was opened in September 1973 as part of a statewide mental health reform initiative. The goal was to move away from warehouse-style asylums and toward personalised care environments. The building had once been a textile factory. It was retrofitted in less than a year, with hospital-grade lighting, modular wards, and underground storage spaces. Much of the southern wing was constructed from scratch, without architectural oversight. Funding was partially provided by the Vermont Behavioral Research Trust, a now defunct organisation linked to several controversial studies on trauma memory and emotional desensitization in the 1970s. Their lead researcher, Dr. Vincent Holder, was quietly named Gracefield's medical director in 1974. Holder had no background in psychiatry. His degrees were in neurochemistry and behavioral modelling. Yet for over a decade he oversaw all patient treatment plans, controlled staff rotations, and approved every medical protocol initiated inside the clinic. He never gave a public interview. When the clinic closed in 1984, he disappeared from public life entirely. No obituary has ever been found. No license ever renewed. His name appears only once in public records after Gracefield, listed on a property deed for a lakeside cabin in Maine. That property burned to the ground in 1986. After the rediscovery of the ledger, several attempts were made to trace the names listed, but there were no corresponding death certificates, no burial plots, no next of kin on file. Many of the patients had been listed as state custodial admissions, meaning they had no legal guardian and no listed family. In essence, they were invisible. Even the clinic's intake forms had been altered. For dozens of patients, the treatment purpose line was left blank. One patient, a woman admitted at age 19 in 1975, was listed only as Case 6B. Her file contained no birth date, no medical history, no psychological assessment, just a photograph. Her face partially obscured by motion blur, one eye looking past the camera. To investigators, the discovery posed a simple but horrifying question. How does a state-run institution lose 154 patients in 11 years without a single public inquiry? The answer would begin to unfold only after archivists uncovered a second, nearly forgotten cache, located not at Gracefield, but in a maintenance office 40 miles away. Inside an unlabeled banker's box was a folder marked Transfer Protocol, Gracefield, Southern Containment. It included room logs, outdated keys, and a partially torn map showing a floor plan that didn't match any of the official blueprints on file. There was a fourth sublevel. It was never mentioned in the original construction records. The floor was designated for high-resistance cases and listed only by code, Ward Null. The existence of Ward Null was never disclosed in any state report, architectural log, or patient family correspondence. Yet the evidence of its presence, buried beneath years of dust, old and forgotten files, was now undeniable. The partial map discovered in the secondary archive revealed a hallway beneath the southern wing of the facility, accessed only by a stairwell, mislabeled as mechanical access. The dimensions were irregular: 3 isolation rooms, 1 observation terminal, no restroom, no emergency exit. A single ventilation shaft connected the floor to the crematorium exhaust system, a feature that had never been formally registered. Of the 154 names listed in the ledger, 37 were marked with a red V beside the entry. On a separate folded page, stapled in haste to the back of the ledger, the following was handwritten in blue pencil: VX verified null, no return, do not discuss, VH. The initials matched those of Dr. Vincent Holder. What exactly null entailed remained a matter of speculation until an audio reel was recovered during a private estate liquidation in 2021. The reel, labelled Staff Induction Protocol, Phase 3, had reportedly belonged to a former Gracefield nurse who died in hospice care. On it, Holder's voice, measured, calm, clinical, explains the objective of null state acclimation. The narration was not addressed to patients, it was a staff recording. We have reached the limit of pharmacological interruption. The objective now is psychological negation. To erase behavioural reaction at the root, one must strip identity. Pain is not the target, recognition is. Once the patient no longer recognises the stimulus or themselves, the trauma loses structure. They become null, free. The tape ran 43 minutes. The final sound was not a voice, but a soft, rhythmic tapping, then silence. Following the ledger's discovery and the subsequent surfacing of the tape, former Gracefield employees were contacted for statements. Most declined. A few responded with short written denials. Only one, a retired janitorial assistant named Cora Lynn Fisher, agreed to speak on the condition of anonymity. Fisher had worked nights at Gracefield from 1978 until 1982. In a recorded interview, she recalled cleaning rooms that weren't on the map, where furniture was bolted to the floor and cameras faced inward. She remembered the lights flickering even when power to the main building had been cut. She remembered delivering meal trays to rooms where no patient ever responded. She remembered the way the nurses whispered when they said certain names. You could tell which ones were being moved, she said. They'd stop calling them by name, just numbers after a while. She also recalled a boy, maybe 11, maybe younger. Fisher never saw him outside his room, but she remembered the tray she left every day untouched. The cup of juice still full, the spoon never used. I'd knock just once, then slide the tray in. One day, I heard a voice whisper, just one word, please. That was the last time I went near that hall. The official records list no patients under the age of 15 admitted to Gracefield. Yet 6 of the entries in the ledger, cross-referenced with height and weight notations, suggest the presence of children. All 6 were marked with the red V. The silence from state authorities was predictable. When contacted for comment, the Vermont Department of Health issued a formal statement. At this time, no conclusive evidence has been presented, indicating malpractice or misconduct during Gracefield's operational years. The department continues to support archival transparency while respecting the confidentiality of historical medical records. But the story didn't fade, it spread. Independent researchers began connecting dots. A string of class action lawsuits filed in the early 1990s, all sealed. A former state inspector found dead in his garage in 1994 ruled a suicide, though the autopsy noted bruising, inconsistent with self-harm. An internal memo from the Vermont Mental Health Board stating, further examination of the Gracefield case may pose reputational risk to state partners. And then, most damning of all, a second letter by Raymond Fell surfaced. It had been mailed anonymously to a regional paper in 1986 but never published. The editor, long since retired, had kept the letter in a personal safe. He'd been afraid to run it, afraid of what it would mean if it were true. The letter was short, but it ended with this: "I still see them, even now, the ones we made disappear. I was told it was therapy, but nothing that quiet should ever be called therapy." The silence surrounding Gracefield wasn't accidental. It was constructed. Brick by brick, file by file. The building had been sealed not just physically, but bureaucratically. What made it so effective was how ordinary it all appeared. Paperwork, logs, staffing schedules, nothing overt, nothing dramatic. Just lines that ended too soon. In one memo dated October 1981, Dr. Holder refers to successfully concluding 18 null trials in the same week. The trials are never described. The names of those 18 do not appear in any public database. The state quietly approved the demolition of Gracefield's southern wing in 2022, citing safety concerns and asbestos levels. But activists intervened, demanding the structure be preserved for historical inquiry. For now, the facility remains sealed, the doors welded shut, the stairwells blocked, the air inside toxic. But the story has already leaked out, through ledger lines, through photos, through unsent letters folded in darkness. The shape of the horror is no longer hidden. It is not myth, not legend, not even rumour. It is record. What makes the tragedy at Gracefield so uniquely chilling is not that it was driven by a single mad doctor or a fringe ideology. It was not religious zealotry. It was not rage. It was policy, structure, routine. It happened during staff shifts, between meal deliveries, on quiet Tuesday mornings, under fluorescent lights and the hum of hospital equipment, conducted by trained professionals in the name of reduction of suffering. The question that lingers, more than any body count, more than any vanished name, is this: how many other Gracefields are still hidden? How many ledgers were never found? And how many victims were so effectively erased that not even their pain remains? By the time Gracefield closed in the winter of 1984, it had served over 1,400 patients. Officially, the number of deaths reported during its 11-year tenure was 18. Unofficially, the ledger told a different story. 154 names, no exit date, no cause of death, just blank space. What they did with those people remains, in many ways, unknowable. But one thing is certain: they were never meant to be remembered. Yet here they are, each name scratched in fading ink, each name now counted, and each name now carried into the next chapter of this story. Because in the spring of 1974, less than a year after Gracefield first opened, its youngest patient arrived. His name was Malcolm Reyes, and he would become the first to vanish behind the walls of Ward Null. Gracefield Clinic officially opened its doors on September 3rd, 1973. The newspaper announcement in the Rutland Daily Herald framed the occasion as a landmark moment in Vermont's mental health reform movement. A full-page photograph showed smiling administrators cutting a pale blue ribbon in front of a newly restored brick building. The caption read, "Gracefield welcomes new era of psychiatric care." Beneath the surface of the headlines, however, the story that began that autumn was neither celebrated nor recorded. It was erased. On October 14th, 1973, just 6 weeks after the ribbon cutting, a 23-year-old woman named Linda Reeve was admitted to Gracefield by emergency referral from Chittenden County Medical. Her intake notes, one of the few surviving documents from the clinic's early months, listed her condition as acute postpartum psychosis with depressive features. She had given birth to her first child 10 days prior. According to her family, she began exhibiting signs of severe dissociation within 48 hours. At one point, she was found standing barefoot in the snow outside her home, whispering the same word again and again, blanket. When her husband brought her to the ER, she reportedly could not recognize her own child. Medical staff noted she was lucid, but emotionally disconnected, showing signs of catatonia alternating with brief outbursts of grief. The psychiatric evaluation team recommended temporary admission to Gracefield, stating the facility offered cutting-edge therapeutic modalities for trauma-induced psychosis. Her family was assured the stay would not exceed 2 weeks. They never saw her again. Gracefield records indicate she was placed in Ward A, Room 112. Her attending physician was listed as Dr. V. Holder. The intake form was signed and stamped with the facility's newly issued state license number. There is no record of discharge. 3 weeks later, when Linda's sister, Rachel Reeve, called the facility for an update, she was told Linda had been transferred to a long-term rehabilitation centre in Maine. No name was provided. When she asked for records or a forwarding contact, she was told those requests needed to be submitted through the Vermont Department of Human Services. She did. The request was denied. The official response, dated November 27, 1973, reads as follows: "Due to the protected status of the patient under Emergency Psychiatric Statute 4B 71.9, we are unable to confirm, deny, or discuss the current whereabouts or condition of Ms. Linda Reeve. All inquiries must be suspended in the interest of therapeutic privacy." For Rachel, the reply was incomprehensible. Linda had no criminal record, no known history of psychiatric illness, no protective custody designation. She was a schoolteacher, a wife, a mother, and now she was gone. Over the next 6 months, Rachel submitted 7 additional inquiries. 3 were returned unopened. 4 received identical denials. In 1975, she filed a civil claim against the Vermont State Hospital System, seeking a court order for the release of Linda's medical records. The case was dismissed without hearing. The judge ruled that the patient's legal status, still officially listed as alive and under protective care, nullified any public release of her information. The court sealed the file permanently. By then, Linda had been missing for over 18 months. The question of what happened to Linda Reeve was never answered directly, but her story was not unique. Throughout the clinic's first year of operation, 61 patients were admitted under acute trauma-related conditions. Of those, 19 had no recorded discharge. 6 had death certificates listing identical causes of death: subdural trauma due to seizure-induced hemorrhage. Another 4 were listed as transferred out of state, but with no destination indicated. The remaining 30, Linda among them, simply disappeared into a bureaucratic void. All were processed by the same attending physician, Dr. Vincent Holder. In late 1974, a year after Gracefield's opening, Holder gave a closed-door lecture to the Vermont Psychiatric Research Board, excerpts of which were later archived in the board's internal journal. In that transcript, Holder described a new experimental protocol he called autonomic trauma release. According to the transcript, we have observed that certain trauma pathologies are sustained not by the memory of the event, but by the organism's resistance to erasure. The conscious mind clings to pain because pain provides structure. Our work at Gracefield has focused on interrupting that process, not through sedation, but through controlled sensory nullification. When the subject loses the anchor of time, light, and identity, the trauma dissolves. We are not treating illness, we are subtracting it. The process, he explained, involved 3 core components: stimulus erasure, elimination of light, sound, and external contact for no less than 72 hours. Identity disruption, removal of all personal items, mirrors, written language, or familiar voices. Cognitive regression, monitoring, daily assessments of language deterioration and behavioural flattening. Holder claimed that within 96 hours, most patients exhibited dramatic improvements in behavioural compliance, often entering a state of what he called cognitive flatline, a term he insisted was not catatonic, but pre-structural. These notes were never included in Gracefield's public treatment literature. No peer-reviewed studies were published. The only trace of these claims comes from the transcript itself, which was never meant for public release. Instead, Gracefield was quietly lauded by state officials as a model of restraint-forward psychiatric care. It was awarded an innovation grant in 1975 for its use of ambient light therapy and somatic de-escalation protocols. What the public didn't know was that those therapies were often window dressing, quite literally. Several of the light therapy rooms photographed for brochures had no patients in them. They had never been used, they were staged. The real treatment rooms, the isolation chambers described in Holder's transcript, were not on the tour. They were located in the lower ward beneath the southern wing, accessed through an unmarked steel door behind the laundry intake. The patients who entered those rooms left no paperwork, no recorded improvement, no interviews, no names, just silence. What makes the early years of Gracefield especially disturbing is not simply the disappearances, but the calculated absence of inquiry. At no point during the 1970s was the facility audited for discharge accuracy. No surprise inspections were conducted when the local Office of Public Health visited the clinic in 1976 at Sata. The only citations issued were related to cafeteria ventilation and staff locker sanitation. Everything else was deemed in satisfactory compliance, because Gracefield looked perfect, on paper. And in the 1970s, perfection was what the public wanted from psychiatric reform. The state needed success stories. The medical community needed innovation. Families needed hope. And Gracefield offered all three, at a cost no one wanted to measure. The disappearance of Linda Reeve did not trigger a news story, a protest, or even a formal inquiry. Her name faded from institutional memory, preserved only in private grief and unofficial ledgers. By 1977, she was legally declared missing. By 1979, her family had stopped asking. What allowed cases like Linda's to vanish without resistance was the systematic erasure of documentation. Medical logs at Gracefield during the 1970s were kept exclusively in hard copy, typed on outdated Remington typewriters and stored in unsecured cabinets. There were no digital backups, no centralized database. Staff frequently used shorthand codes for patient statuses, and when new regulations were introduced in 1978 requiring standardized discharge summaries, Gracefield requested and was granted a temporary exemption due to record-keeping constraints related to architectural limitations. In plain terms, they couldn't or wouldn't comply. Several former administrative workers from that era, contacted decades later, recalled frequent inconsistencies in file contents. One, a transcriptionist named Elaine Hargreaves, stated in a 2003 oral history interview, sometimes a discharge would be filed before the patient ever left. Other times, we'd be told to log a transfer without knowing where the patient was sent. Once, I was told to destroy a file because the patient never existed officially. You don't forget instructions like that. What emerges from this period is a picture of deliberate obfuscation, a culture in which red flags were painted over with compliance language, where clinical terms became shields against accountability. Perhaps the most chilling example comes from a series of death certificates issued between 1974 and 1976. A forensic archivist working independently in 2015 uncovered 9 certificates, filed by the same attending coroner, signed with the same pen, and listing the exact same cause of death: acute muscular arrest following trauma desensitization. The term trauma desensitization does not appear in any formal medical literature. It was, by all available evidence, a fabricated diagnosis. One certificate belonged to a man named Joseph White, age 52, committed to Gracefield after a suicide attempt. Another belonged to Beverly Young, age 29, described in court records as emotionally reactive to childhood abuse. A third was assigned to Donald Clary, age 17, who had reportedly suffered a psychotic break after witnessing his father's drowning. Each of these individuals was pronounced dead within 6 days of admission. Each certificate was filed without autopsy. Each family was told the same phrase: complications arising from pre-existing trauma. Gracefield, meanwhile, continued to rise in public esteem. By 1978, it was being featured in regional medical journals as a case study in cost-effective, results-oriented care. Its reported patient recovery rate, based on internally published data, was over 80%. It was described as a model of humane psychiatric transition. There was no mention of the patients who had simply disappeared, no mention of the sealed rooms beneath the southern annex, no mention of the children. In one archived newsletter dated December 1907, Gracefield was praised for its unique approach to sensory recalibration. A photograph accompanying the article shows a therapist guiding a patient through what appears to be a gentle stretching exercise under warm lighting. The therapist's badge is cropped from the image. The patient's face is turned away. A small handwritten note on the back of the photo, preserved in a former staff scrapbook, reads, "Staged for Grant Team, no real patients present." What becomes evident by the end of 1979 is that Gracefield had perfected the art of concealment. Every photograph, every newsletter, every press release was carefully manicured. Tours for visiting officials were pre-scheduled and limited to wards A and B, both freshly painted, both underpopulated during inspections. Rooms that housed null phase patients, those subjected to Holder's sensory erasure protocols, were never shown. Their names were never used. The horror of Gracefield in 1973 wasn't that it operated in secret, it operated in plain sight. The patients walked in through the front doors. Their families signed the papers. Their files were stamped, their photos taken, and then the lights went out, the records ended, and they were gone. What makes these disappearances particularly disturbing is how they were made to appear ordinary. No screaming, no dragging bodies down corridors, just quiet paperwork, quiet signatures, and quiet instructions whispered to staff behind closed doors. Holder's vision for the clinic was never about healing, it was about deletion. He believed that trauma was not something to be treated, but something to be removed, like a tumour. He believed that identity was a byproduct of memory, and that memory, when stripped of sensory anchors, would collapse in on itself. He believed that by erasing the structure of suffering, he could return a person to an unformed state. His notes, preserved only in fragments, reveal this chilling line: silence is not absence, silence is freedom. But silence is not freedom. Silence is what allowed 154 human beings to vanish without anyone asking why. By the time Gracefield entered its 6th year of operation, the pattern had solidified. Patients with complex trauma diagnoses were disproportionately subjected to Holder's programs. Family inquiries were blocked, files were sealed, transfers were falsified, death certificates were manufactured, and Linda Reeve remained missing. In 1981, Rachel Reeve moved out of state. She married, changed her name, and stopped speaking about her sister. In a rare interview, in 2009, she said, "It wasn't grief that broke me. It was the way the world kept going, like she had never existed, like I had made her up." Linda's birth certificate still exists, her school records, her wedding license, the photograph of her in her hospital bed holding her newborn son. But her medical file is gone. Her discharge summary does not exist, and Gracefield's logs show no patient by her name ever being released. What Gracefield did in its first year was more than a clerical failure. It was an engineered vanishing, the construction of an administrative void into which people could fall, quietly, completely, and permanently. And in 1974, 1 year after Linda disappeared, that void would claim its youngest victim. His name was Malcolm Reyes. He was 11 years old, and his intake form was never signed. In the spring of 1975, Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic was in its 2nd year of operation. The snow had receded from the wooded hills outside Rutland County, and the southern wing of the facility, rarely visited by visitors or inspectors, was undergoing routine maintenance after a minor boiler failure. Among the part-time workers brought in that season was a man named Ernest Weller, 42 years old, divorced, former military supply clerk, hired on a temporary custodial contract for deep cleaning and utility check-ins. He worked at Gracefield for just under 9 weeks. Then, without giving notice, he quit and filed a sealed report with the Rutland County Sheriff's Department. The document remained buried in a side drawer of the Sheriff's Administrative Archive until 1998, when it was rediscovered during a departmental digitization project. It had never been followed up, never logged in the state database, never assigned a case number. Inside the folder were 3 pages of dense handwriting. Weller had labelled it simply, Observation at Gracefield Facility, May 1975. The account begins with an unusual maintenance task. Weller had been asked to inspect the laundry vent system in Ward C, where linens from isolation rooms were sent for sterilisation. According to his report, the staff had been complaining of a sour odour seeping up through the floor grates near the utility closet. Weller assumed it was a drainage issue, but the smell, he wrote, was unlike anything he had encountered in his military years. Not rot, not mildew. It was sharp, not sewage, like burned meat with a chemical edge. It stuck to my nostrils, even after I left the room. Following the ductwork, Weller traced the odour to a vertical chute leading down into the lowest sublevel of the southern wing. The chute was labelled Linen Incinerator, but the hospital blueprints, later confirmed by municipal records, made no mention of any incineration equipment within Ward C or its sublevels. Weller described standing near the base of the chute one evening around 8:30 p.m. while performing an after-hours circuit. The corridor was empty, lights were dimmed. Most of the ward staff had already left for the day. He heard the creak of wheels. He turned and saw a gurney being pushed down the hallway by a nurse he did not recognise. On the gurney was a human figure covered entirely in a thick white sheet. Weller's description is specific. The feet weren't bound, they were loose, bare, no motion. I didn't see breathing, I didn't see a monitor, just the sheet. According to his report, the gurney was taken into the unlit laundry annex room, a room that by architectural plans was no longer in use. Weller wrote that the nurse emerged 2 minutes later, alone. No patient was wheeled back out. He did not confront the nurse. He did not report the event to his supervisor. But in the following days, he claims to have seen the same pattern at least twice more. A gurney, after dark, covered, wheeled into the annex, and never returned. The odour, he wrote, became stronger after each night. By early June, Weller had begun taking personal notes of the night shifts. He kept a pocket notebook, now missing, but referenced in his deposition. He wrote down names he heard mentioned during meal rounds. One name appeared again and again, Harold K. Harold K. was not listed in the official Gracefield patient intake logs, but a torn page recovered from a medical notepad, discovered years later during site excavation, contained an entry, Harold K. observed 72H post R4, language regression likely, nails require monitoring. Harold K.'s name would surface again, not in official documents, but in a small, unmarked composition journal uncovered in a locked drawer during a salvage operation in 2004. The journal, its cover water-stained and its pages warped with age, contained a series of short entries, all written in the same slanted, uneven hand. There was no date, no signature, but every fourth page included the initials HK written at the top in red pencil. One of the final entries read, "I can hear the others screaming through the vents, and I swear one voice is mine." The writing was lucid, controlled. The phrases repeated themselves with increasing dissonance, as if memory was being eroded line by line. Another entry, earlier in the journal, described what the writer called the retraining room. "We line up on Wednesdays. That's the rule. They don't speak. They don't explain. We're not allowed to sleep the night before. I forget my name during the silence. But they say that's the point." There is no record of such a program at Gracefield, but Weller's report, submitted to the county sheriff, makes an oblique reference to a gathering of patients in Ward C during the same week. Patients dressed in identical grey uniforms, eyes covered with dark fabric, standing in silence near the old laundry room. Weller described one woman rocking in place, humming something with no melody. He left Gracefield the following day and never returned. His report concluded with a single sentence: "Whatever they're doing down there, it isn't medicine." It's worth noting that the incinerator chute Weller described, listed as non-operational in the 1973 facility blueprints, was later found to be connected to a reinforced duct system that ran beneath the sub-level foundation. During a forensic mapping in 2017, investigators discovered that the ductwork terminated in a sealed chamber with no external exit. No incinerator was ever found. Yet chemical residue consistent with high-temperature tissue breakdown, sodium phosphate, potassium nitrate, and trace elements of calcium ash was identified in a sediment sample taken from directly beneath the southern wing's foundation. The state declined to pursue excavation. What makes this account especially haunting is the banality of it, the quiet normalcy with which the horror was conducted. There were no screams echoing through the facility, no alarms, no missing persons bulletins, just an odour, a gurney, a journal, a sealed room beneath a laundry vent. No one was ever charged, no inquiry was launched. The only trace that anything had happened at all came from a man no one remembered and a patient the system never recorded. In the sterile language of the institution, patients like Harold weren't victims. They were non-responsive subjects. Their journals weren't evidence. They were contraband. Their names weren't erased. They were never written down. It's not uncommon in the history of institutional care for records to be incomplete, for documents to go missing, for policies to change without notice. But what happened at Gracefield wasn't the result of clerical failure. It was the result of design. Gracefield had created an environment where the act of forgetting was built into the foundation, where isolation was policy, where silence was medicine, where a man like Ernest Weller could smell death and find no door to knock on. And by the end of 1975, the odour in the laundry room was gone. But so was Harold K. And in 1976, a new intake was recorded under the initials MR. The patient was 11 years old, and unlike Harold, his name would eventually be remembered. By 1977, the Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic had earned a quiet reputation for innovation. Behind closed doors, state officials referred to a model facility, an institution where difficult patients could be treated with dignity, discipline, and discretion. But inside the clinic itself, a new program was unfolding, one that left no mark in public documentation, one that left its patients irrevocably altered. The program was called Induction Null. Its existence would remain unknown for over a decade. No grant funded it. No journal published it. It was never presented at psychiatric conferences or cited in policy reports. And yet by 1977, at least 36 patients had undergone the full Induction Null procedure. Dr. Vincent Holder, the clinic's director, was its architect. His notes, preserved only in fragments, described Induction Null as a complete sensory interruption designed to reset the trauma-conditioned mind. The protocol was reportedly inspired by Cold War intelligence experiments in sensory deprivation and behavioural restructuring. But where government agencies stopped at data collection, Holder pushed further. According to an internal treatment memo recovered during a 1989 civil case, Induction Null was implemented in patients showing resistant trauma looping, persistent emotional volatility, or psychosocial fragmentation. None of these terms were formally defined, but they appear in over 24 Gracefield patient notes between 1907 and 1981, often as justifications for isolation. The procedure involved placing patients in stimulus void chambers for 96 hours. The rooms, 12 in total, all located beneath Ward C, were temperature controlled and lined with foam insulation. No lights, no windows, no audible noise. The beds were rubberized slabs with restraints sewn into the frame. Patients were given intravenous fluids. Sedatives were administered on a rotating schedule. Bathroom access was withheld. Monitors tracked vital signs. No staff entered during the isolation window. There are no surviving patient waivers, no consent forms, no psychological outcome assessments. Only the outcomes themselves. One orderly, interviewed in 2006 under condition of anonymity, recalled, "They said it was therapy, that it would help them forget. But the ones that came back out, if they came back out, were blank, like someone had erased the middle of them." The state maintains no formal record of Induction Null, but in 1989, a misfiled document surfaced in an unrelated medical negligence case. The document, stamped "Internal Use Only, Gracefield Clinic," outlined the philosophical justification for the procedure. Near the bottom of the page, a single line appeared in bold type: "Consent is unnecessary when healing the root wound." To understand what Induction Null did and what it took, we turn to the case of Malcolm Reyes. Malcolm was admitted to Gracefield in August of 1977 at the age of 15. 3 months earlier, he had survived a house fire that claimed the lives of both parents and his younger sister. Malcolm had been pulled from the second floor with third-degree burns along his left arm and shoulder. Witnesses described him as unresponsive in the weeks following the fire, refusing to speak, eat, or acknowledge others. Initially held at a children's psychiatric wing in Burlington, Malcolm was transferred to Gracefield under emergency custodial status. His referral form, still on file in the state archives, lists the reason for transfer as unmanageable emotional regression. He was placed in Ward B under Dr. Holder's direct supervision. Within 3 weeks, nursing notes described Malcolm as resistant to interaction, verbally absent, but physically compliant. He was moved to Ward C. From there, his records become sparse. A final note, dated December 4th, reads, "Induction complete. Subject neurologically flat. No further treatment scheduled. No discharge summary, no transfer file, no autopsy report." Malcolm Reyes was never recorded as deceased, nor was he ever seen again outside Gracefield. The only visual documentation that exists is a single black and white photograph found in a long sealed file drawer in the southern wing. It shows a boy, thin, shirtless, knees to chest, arms wrapped around his legs. His eyes are open but unfocused. He is seated on a bare floor, facing the corner of a windowless room. A caption, written on the back in fading blue ink, reads simply, "EMSA post-induction, day 4. Several former orderlies confirm the boy in the image is Malcolm Reyes. None can say what happened to him afterward." What makes Induction Null so terrifying is not only the silence surrounding it, but its ideology. The belief that memory, identity, and trauma could be chemically and environmentally deleted, that people could be rewritten by subtraction, that consent was optional if suffering could be erased. There is no evidence that Induction Null ever cured anyone. No names of recovered patients, no studies, no metrics. But there are patterns. Of the patients known to have undergone the procedure, nearly all vanished from public record within 6 months. Some were marked transferred without a destination. Others were labelled unresponsive and filed under archival disposal codes. And a handful, like Malcolm, were listed only by their initials and a cryptic designation, V. Null. The implication was always the same. The person no longer existed, at least not as a patient, not as someone who could ask to leave. By 1981, the procedure was discontinued, not because it failed, but because the basement rooms were sealed shut. State authorities never investigated. No lawsuits were allowed to proceed. The clinic cited privacy protections and treatment confidentiality. And the victims, what remained of them, were left behind walls no one would open. As the sun set on Gracefield's so-called golden years, its patients were being treated in ways that erased more than pain. They erased the person. Malcolm Reyes never left the facility, but his name remains in the intake logs. and his initials, MR, are circled in red in the original Gracefield ledger, discovered years later in a rusted cabinet behind a collapsed wall. His was the first name marked as verified null. The others would follow. In February of 1979, the Vermont Office of Institutional Oversight scheduled a formal audit of Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic. The announcement came in response to 2 separate complaints filed within a 2-month span, both submitted by former staff members. One, a junior nurse named Evelyn Hart, cited ethical violations and unsanctioned drug administration. The second came from a facilities assistant who requested anonymity, stating only that he had witnessed procedures not consistent with psychiatric care. On paper, the audit was to be routine. A team of 5 investigators, 2 administrative auditors, and 1 medical consultant were to arrive at Gracefield on March 12th. The inspection would focus on treatment records, pharmaceutical inventories, and custodial oversight. But 3 days before the team was scheduled to arrive, the audit was cancelled. The reason given was a budgetary misalignment with statewide oversight goals. No further explanation was provided. The official record lists the cancellation as permanent. At the time, no one outside the Office of Oversight questioned the decision. But internal correspondence, unsealed decades later during a class action lawsuit, tells a different story. A memo dated March 8, 1979, written by State Administrator Charles L. Rourke, reads, "Concerns have been raised regarding the timing of the Gracefield inspection. Significant private investment is currently linked to pharmaceutical research at the site. Please consider postponement in coordination with the Ethics Working Group." The reference to private investment was not elaborated on in the document, but a second letter, this one handwritten and marked confidential, was attached. It contained a list of compound IDs, medical batch codes, and 3 company names. One of them, Vestra Neurological. Vestra was a boutique pharmaceutical firm based out of Boston, known in the 1970s for experimental neurochemical compounds intended for clinical stress testing. In 1976, Vestra had filed a state partnership application to pilot behavioral modification drugs in institutional environments. Their application was denied by the Vermont Board of Medicine, but their financials, obtained through court discovery, show regular payments to Gracefield from 1907 to 1981. The payments were labelled clinical facilitation fees. The amounts were substantial. Gracefield had quietly become a hybrid facility, part state-funded psychiatric institution, part human lab. The patients, many of them committed under emergency statutes, were legally powerless to refuse treatment. Most had no family advocates. Many had no living relatives at all. The staff were told it was innovation. They were told it was the future of psychiatry. They were told not to ask questions. One nurse did. Her name was Valerie Dunn. Dunn had worked at Gracefield for just under 2 years. Initially assigned to Ward A, she transferred to the Southern Wing in late 1978, shortly after the Induction Null protocol had been expanded. In her time there, she filed 3 internal incident reports, none of which were acknowledged. The third report, dated February 5, 1979, was different. It wasn't routed through her supervisor. It was mailed directly to the Vermont Department of Public Health. The letter, obtained through civil court filings, outlines a specific concern. On January 31st, I observed patient C114 undergoing severe convulsions following a second injection of compound R12. The attending staff informed me the patient was catatonic, but I witnessed vocalization. She said one word. She said, "Please." Valerie's letter was never officially received. There is no record of it being entered into the department's tracking system, but 2 weeks later, on February 19th, Valerie was found dead in her apartment. The cause of death was ruled suicide. Toxicology reported a fatal dose of barbiturates, consistent with drugs stocked at Gracefield. Her death was not investigated further. Her incident reports were sealed. Compound R12, the substance she referenced, does not appear in any public medical registry. No trial data, no FDA acknowledgement. But within Gracefield's own storage inventory, recovered after the facility's closure, R12 appears multiple times across handwritten dosage logs, often with phrases like repeat dosage withheld, suboptimal response, or non-verbal compliance achieved. Gracefield had not simply failed an inspection, it had never been inspected at all. The cancellation of the audit did more than delay accountability. It permanently altered the course of every patient under Gracefield's care that year. With the oversight team withdrawn, internal policies were expanded without challenge. Medical logs from April through December 1979 show an uptick in unverified chemical protocols. Dosages were adjusted, isolation periods extended, the term informed consent vanished entirely from staff notes. By mid-year, staff turnover accelerated. Nurses and junior orderlies resigned quietly. Others, including Evelyn Hart, the original whistleblower, left the state. She declined all interviews in the years that followed, but in one brief affidavit filed during a 2005 inquiry, she wrote, "Gracefield was not a clinic, it was a test site. The drugs didn't heal people, they removed them." That same year, 1979, the patient count dropped by 40. There were no corresponding death certificates, no transfers, no explanations. Ward C, according to shift logs, operated at full capacity through the summer, but by October, half of its rooms were listed as vacant. The files for the missing patients contain a single, identical stamp: non-responsive, facility record closed. Those same files list no next of kin, no autopsy requests, no burial arrangements. What happened that year at Gracefield was not an accident. It was not the result of one doctor's misconduct or a bureaucratic error. It was a system functioning exactly as designed, shielded from inquiry, saturated in funding, and calibrated for silence. The horror wasn't what was done to the patients, it was that no one stopped it. What should have been the beginning of accountability, the 1979 audit, became a blueprint for erasure. The audit was not postponed, it was absorbed, dissolved into layers of compliance, redirected by private money and quiet influence. The death of Valerie Dunn didn't trigger an investigation, it triggered a vacancy. Her replacement, a nurse from out of state, signed an NDA as part of her contract. Her name has never appeared in any interview. Her personnel file, like so many others, is missing. And yet the trail remains, in the margins of forgotten memos, the smudged corners of intake logs, and the silence between discharge entries. It is in the note Valerie left in her own handwriting, found among her effects. They told me she was catatonic, but she begged me to let her out. There is no record of who she was, but from April to December 1979, 13 female patients were admitted to Ward C. By year's end, only 4 remained. 9 names, 9 missing persons, no exit documentation. Their absence was never questioned. Not by the state, not by the families, if they had any left, not by the public, because Gracefield continued to be held up as a success. In a 1980 publication by the Vermont Medical Review, Gracefield was referred to as a quiet triumph of regional psychiatric reform. It had, the report stated, achieved outcomes unmatched by comparable institutions in the Northeast. There were no footnotes, no metrics, just silence. What makes the events of 1979 so disturbing is not their violence, but their quietness. The killings, if we can even call them that, were not done with force. They were done with forms, with invoices, with dosage slips and erased appointment logs. Gracefield was not haunted, it was funded, and by the end of 1979, 40 fewer patients existed than at the start of the year. Their rooms repainted, their names replaced by new initials, their identities folded into the walls, and 3 floors below, in a locked chamber that no inspector ever reached, one final note was taped to the back of a patient door. Subject has not spoken in 6 days, has begun biting at his own hand. Reinduction, scheduled for January 3rd. Case M. Reyes. The audit had never come, but the experiments continued. In the winter of 1981, Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic submitted a set of construction permits to the Vermont Department of Public Health. The documents described routine infrastructure reinforcement beneath the southern wing, foundation bracing, and subgrade environmental control. The work was approved without inspection. A small team of contractors, hired directly by the clinic, began excavation in February. What those permits failed to mention was that the substructure being altered did not exist in the state's original blueprints. The 1973 architectural plans for Gracefield show 3 underground levels: mechanical storage, file archives, and overflow patient intake. But by 1981, records indicate the addition of a 4th level, listed only as structural sub-B access controlled. There was no elevator stop for this floor, no service logs, no medical equipment deliveries. Yet procurement orders from the same month include 120 feet of steel reinforcement bar, 8 welded bulkhead doors, and 12 biometric lock plates. The materials were delivered, the floor was sealed, and no explanation was given. What happened beneath Gracefield that year was not reinforcement, it was burial. Blueprints recovered in 2002 from a condemned city storage locker show an altered floor plan. The new map includes a corridor that runs beneath Ward C, terminating in an L-shaped row of small windowless cells. There are no restrooms, no nurse stations. Each room is labelled Null Chamber. The hallway leading to these rooms was designated by a different name. In the margins of the blueprint, scrawled in red pencil, are the words Whisper Ward. The name came not from administrators, but from staff, those few who worked long enough to notice what wasn't being said. Raymond Fell was one of them. Fell had served as a night orderly since 1974. By 1981, he had been moved to the lowest levels of Gracefield, tasked with quiet patient monitoring. In an unpublished interview, recorded on cassette 2 years before his death, Fell described the corridor in detail. There were no lights in the cells, just soft audio, something like white noise but higher pitched, like a slow, steady whistle. The walls were padded, but you could still hear them, not talking, not screaming, humming. Fell claimed that the patients kept there were those who had failed the induction null process, individuals whose minds had not flattened but fragmented. He remembered at least one by name, Agnes Mill. Agnes had been 17 when she was admitted in 1980. She had suffered from disorganized schizophrenia, compounded by post-traumatic symptoms from years in foster care. Fell remembered her not for her violence, but for her voice. She'd sing when she was scared, nursery rhymes mostly, but near the end, it wasn't words anymore, just rhythm. She'd sit in the corner and hum the same pattern for hours. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. And then she stopped responding at all. Fell said that by the end of the summer, Agnes had been moved into one of the whisper chambers. He was not told why. He was not told for how long. But the next time he brought food to the chamber door, the tray was not taken. When he asked if she had been removed, he was told, flatly, "She's done humming." Over time, Fell claimed, the humming spread. One patient would begin, followed by another in the next chamber. Not the same melody, not in unison, but overlapping. A low rhythmic static that filled the corridor during the midnight hours. Staff began wearing earplugs on shift. Several refused to enter the floor entirely. The official explanation? Auditory hallucination contagion. But that wasn't what concerned Fell. It wasn't the sound that scared me, he said. It was when the humming stopped, all at once, like a light going out in a building you didn't know had power. In September 1981, a final construction report was filed. The southern wing's sublevel was declared environmentally non-viable. Air circulation was deemed inadequate. Moisture damage and load stress were cited. The solution? Complete enclosure. Contractors were ordered to weld shut all 4 access doors to the corridor. Vents were sealed, lighting circuits were cut, no demolition, no removal, just a permanent barrier. The report listed the floor as retired. No patients were transferred, no names were logged, no remains were recovered. To this day, that section of the building has never been reopened. Investigators who visited the site in 1998 described steel seams covered in industrial cork, heavy bolts rusted into place, and concrete poured directly over drainage slots. Behind one of the barriers, a faint indentation remains in the metal. Something shaped like a hand. What happened in that corridor was not medicine, it was abandonment. The patients left in the whisper ward were not forgotten. They were silenced, no lights, no clocks, no food deliveries after September 12, 1981. What makes this part of Gracefield's history so horrifying isn't simply the method, it's the motive. These weren't executions, they were edits. The clinic didn't just remove dangerous patients, it removed the data. The hallway itself was redacted from memory, converted from a corridor to a sealed myth, a buried rumour held only in the final words of a dying orderly. You could hear them scratching, Fell said. You could smell the rot under the walls. Then it stopped. And nothing is louder than when the humming ends. When the southern wing was condemned in 1984, demolition crews were told not to disturb the lower foundation. Environmental hazard, they were told, but there was no asbestos report, no mould survey, no structural collapse, just a warning, do not cut below sub B. With the whisper ward sealed, Gracefield had completed its final transformation. The patients weren't cured, they weren't relocated, they were contained, and 3 years later, the entire facility would be shut down for good. But by then, the doors had already been welded, and behind those doors, the names remained unspoken. In the spring of 1984, the Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic shut its doors without ceremony. The official statement, issued by the Vermont Office of State Institutions, cited budgetary contraction and reduced patient intake. The building was sealed, staff were reassigned, all files not transferred to Montpelier were boxed and buried beneath layers of dust in county archives. No public inquiry was launched. No patients were formally discharged. No final count was ever issued. But one ledger remained. The document, discovered in 2019 inside a rusted cabinet behind a collapsed storage wall, listed 154 names. Among them, a final grouping stood out. 11 names, unlined, unannotated, all listed in sequence. No discharge, no date of death, just one phrase written beside each. Code V null. Unlike earlier entries marked with transferred or non-responsive, these names were grouped with mechanical precision. The handwriting was sharper, the ink darker, and beside the column of names was a single drawn line, under which someone had written in capital letters, "End of registry." It wasn't a note, it was a finalization. These were not the last patients to be treated, they were the last to be recorded. The term V null had appeared only once before, on an internal Gracefield document uncovered during a sealed deposition in 2003. At the time, its meaning remained unclear. Some assumed it referred to a medication protocol, others, a behavioural status. But in 2020, a researcher at the University of Vermont unearthed a declassified memorandum from the Department of Psychological Research, dated 1983. The memo, part of a Cold War behavioural strategy archive, described an experimental concept: voluntary cognitive nullification. The theory was radical. It proposed that certain high-risk trauma cases, patients with violent psychosis, unrecoverable PTSD, or delusional affective disorder, could be humanely reset by erasing the structures of memory and identity through non-invasive means. Not with surgery, but with environment. The process relied on two mechanisms: total sensory deprivation over prolonged intervals, chemical disruption of memory recall pathways. The procedure, according to the memo, had never been trialled. It lacked ethical approval. No clinical guidelines were attached, but the final paragraph raised alarm. While no state-sponsored institution, is currently cleared for implementation. Preliminary assets have been established to model feasibility in controlled psychiatric populations. The address attached to the header: Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic, Southern Wing, Sublevel B. What followed was a name: V Null Protocol. Voluntary in theory, nullification in effect. Except there was nothing voluntary about what happened to the final 11. Patient files linked to the 11 names were never found, but Gracefield's physical logs list equipment requisitions consistent with long-term isolation. Temperature stabilization tanks, restraint platforms, intravenous nutrient systems, and, most disturbing, sedation schedules written in triple dosage. 2 of the 11 were children, the youngest 9 years old. Her name, Agnes Mill. Agnes had been placed at Gracefield in late 1983 following a state ward emergency hold. Her intake form is partially preserved. It lists her behavioural symptoms as hyperreactive emotionality and imagined threat response. She had been moved across 3 foster homes in as many years. Gracefield accepted her as a special placement under an extended behavioural containment program. Less than 6 weeks after her arrival, her name appears in the ledger, listed 7th among the 11. Her room has never been found, but one photograph survives. Recovered from a mislabeled envelope in a storage locker, the photo shows a small girl seated on the bare floor of what appears to be a padded room. Her hands are pressed to her mouth. The wall behind her is smeared with something dark. At the bottom of the image, a caption has been scratched in red pen. Lipstick, mirror broken, written backwards on east wall: "I am not what they say I am." The photo was not official. It wasn't stamped. It was never meant to be seen. But it told the truth more clearly than any chart. Agnes wasn't a danger. She was a child, and someone tried to remember her. The rest of the final 11 are more difficult to trace. Many were state custodial patients, individuals admitted under emergency care laws, often without family or legal advocates. Their names, when cross-referenced against social service intake forms, show no prior hospitalizations. In some cases, no birth records at all. They entered Gracefield quietly, and they never left. Raymond Fell, the long-serving night orderly, remembered the change in protocol during that final year. In a surviving audio tape recorded shortly before his death, Fell describes the 11 not as patients, but as subjects. They stopped giving them numbers, just initials: Mr. AM, DL. They had no visitors, no meal logs, no recorded sessions. Their doors weren't locked from the outside. They were bolted shut and sealed with acoustic padding. Fell claimed he was no longer permitted to speak with them. Instructions were clear: no interaction, no interruption. One of the last entries in his log reads, "Chamber 4, quiet, no sound for 6 days, no tray collection, no vocalizations." Nurse on duty shrugged and said, "They're still in there." But the door never opened. He had worked there for 11 years. He left that night and never returned. The term nullification was never defined in any formal document, but its results were visible in the treatment equipment abandoned after closure. Rooms stripped of lights, windowless chambers with sound-dampening foam and anchor rings drilled into the floor. Inside one, a strip of medical tape was found, still stuck to the wall. In faded ink, Subject 9, movement ceased, fluids withheld. The horror of the final 11 isn't that they died, it's that no one ever confirmed they had. Their identities weren't erased by accident, they were erased by design. No tombstones, no morgue receipts, no coroner's tags, just names, preserved in a ledger, a single ink stroke separating their existence from extinction. And one final column, V Null. The gravity of that designation becomes clearer when viewed through the language of the system. V for voluntary, a legal pretense, a shield against liability. Null for nothingness, not healed, not transferred, not dead, just removed. What makes this revelation unbearable isn't just the precision of it, it's the intention. These weren't victims of a failed program, they were its success stories. The process worked. The identities vanished, the records ended, the building was shuttered, and the silence began. But the ledger remained, and in 2019, for the first time since 1984, the names were counted. 11 grouped, labelled, unacknowledged, each one a person, a voice, a history, each one sealed behind bureaucratic walls and psychiatric doctrine. What had begun as a clinic became a pipeline. What had once claimed to heal had evolved to erase, and the final 11 were its proof. There are no documentaries about these patients, no trials, no televised outrage, because the system that consumed them was never forced to answer for them. The silence was too complete, the paper trail too carefully pruned, but a name in ink still resists. Agnes Mill, 9 years old, wrote on the wall with lipstick, "I am not what they say I am." And she was right. She wasn't a number. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't what they said. She was someone. And now, because of one forgotten ledger, one unsent letter, and one surviving photograph, she is again. All 11 names preserved by accident, buried by design, can now be spoken aloud. Not just as victims, but as evidence. Evidence that the darkest horrors of Gracefield were not monstrous in form, but medical in tone. Cold, clinical, sanitized by process and procedure. And though Gracefield closed in 1984, the echo of what it did remained. In the lives not lived, in the rooms never reopened, in the silence that tried and failed to become permanent. One scene remains, but the count is already final. 4 names, the 11 last, and every one of them, once forgotten, now counted. The building still stands, at the edge of Rutland County, just off a gravel road, choked by overgrowth. The Gracefield Psychiatric Clinic remains sealed, its windows boarded, its entrances welded, its hallways dark since the spring of 1984. There are no signs, no fencing, just a rusted iron gate and a crumbling stone perimeter. The state lists the facility as inactive institutional property, designated for demolition, but no contractor has yet touched it. What's left behind is not just concrete and mould, it's something quieter, something heavier. Silence. Not the silence of abandonment, but of refusal, of doors that will not open, of questions no one is required to answer. Since the rediscovery of the Gracefield ledger in 2019, a slow wave of public interest has followed. Families of former patients, some still living in Vermont, have begun to ask questions. Most receive no response. The Department of Health acknowledges the facility's closure, but not its contents. The Office of Mental Health confirms the building is structurally unsafe, but offers no timeline for its demolition. And the records? They remain sealed. Several families have filed lawsuits, civil claims, freedom of information requests, appeals to unseal autopsy reports, or obtain transfer logs. All were dismissed, every one. The court cited the same phrase, insufficient documentation for actionable claim. Without dates, without bodies, without signatures, there is no case. And so Gracefield has become what it was always meant to be. Unprovable, untouchable, but not forgotten. In the last decade, the building has drawn attention from elsewhere. Not from officials or archivists, but from the curious, urban explorers, independent journalists, students, historians. They come with cameras, with handheld recorders, with notebooks and Geiger counters and audio scanners. Some claim to have heard humming behind the sealed steel doors of the southern wing. Others describe a low mechanical sound, like a vent fan, spinning deep underground. Most find nothing, just empty rooms, rusted trolleys, wallpaper curled like dried skin, file drawers pulled open and emptied long ago. But occasionally something remains, a slip of paper, a photograph, a strip of medical tape still stuck to a padded wall. These fragments, gathered over the years, do not tell a full story, but they confirm one thing. Someone was there, many someones, and they were not treated, they were erased. Among the most disturbing of these remnants was a box of administrative files discovered during a flood recovery in 2021. The box had been mislabeled and stored in a basement of the Rutland County Records building. Inside were employment forms, shift logs, incident reports, and a letter, written in black ink, folded into thirds, water-stained at the edges. It was signed Raymond Fell, the same night orderly who had once testified, in whispers and fragments, to what he saw. This letter had never been mailed, but it was addressed. To whom it may concern. The handwriting is uneven in places, the ink smudged where dampness had crept in, but enough remained to read what mattered. I do not know who will find this. I am not sure I want them to. But if you are reading, it means someone opened what was not meant to be opened. They'll say the numbers don't match, that the files are wrong, that the records can't be trusted. But they know. They've always known. I was there when the rooms were sealed. I know what was left behind. I remember the names that stopped being spoken. If you find this, count them. Count all of them, and do not let them be forgotten. His final words are difficult to decipher. The paper had torn near the bottom, but the last full line is clear. There is no justice here, only memory. That more than anything defines the legacy of Gracefield. Not scandal, not prosecution, memory, and memory is all that's left. The photos, the ledger, the initials scratched into door frames, the torn corner of a chart that lists a girl as unresponsive, though someone later found her handwriting on the wall. These are not ghosts, they are facts. The horror of Gracefield never needed to be exaggerated, because it never hid behind folklore or fiction. It hid behind protocol, behind forms and checkboxes and acronyms. It didn't bury its dead, it deleted them. No lights remain on inside the building. The windows have long since collapsed inward. But beneath it, beneath the southern wing, concrete slabs still cover the welded corridor where the final patients were sealed. No one has opened it, no one has tried, and maybe that's the worst part, because if Gracefield teaches us anything, it's this. The most terrifying monsters don't wear masks. They wear badges, and they carry clipboards. There is no ending to this story, because no one wrote one. They just closed the file and walked away. But for those willing to look, the file was never empty.